Hello, friends, and welcome to the March 22nd edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's engagement director. And today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And today, as my two kids return to their public schools after a week off for spring break, this year, it only lasted a week instead of 9 months. We're going to be talking about an issue that is important to many, if not most, if not all, Texans of faith and our communities. We're going to be talking about our public schools with Ellen Williams. Then we'll welcome Josh Houston for our legislative update and action alert, which this week will focus heavily on voting rights and police reform. If you want to go ahead and start pulling up that action alert now, Josh is going to work through it the second half of the program. You can find that at texasimpact.org in the Action Center. But before all of that, I am excited to welcome to the conversation my friend and a great friend of Texas Impact, the Executive Associate Minister at First United Methodist Church of Dallas, Reverend Holly Bandel. And Holly, we were talking before we came on that we would not talk about basketball today because I saw in your bio that you are a graduate of Duke Divinity School and a big fan of their basketball program. As a Texas alum, we're just not going to talk basketball today unless you want to bring up your University of North Texas Mean Green. But I do think that we can both agree about the importance of public education. We were talking before we came on about the incredible work that First United Methodist Church of Dallas has done in supporting your public schools. So we also talked about the steps that we've all been taking with the pandemic. And so I can't think of a better person today to bring on for our weekly word than you. So Reverend Bandel, thanks for all that you do. And I'm going to now turn it over to you for this week's weekly word.
Thanks so much, Scott. It is an honor to be here. Hi, friends out there with Texas Impact. It is great to be with you today. And as I was getting ready for this, there was a scripture verse from the Christian scripture in Matthew chapter 7 that came to mind about giving good gifts to children. And certainly when we're talking about public education, that's it, is that it's about giving all of those God-given grace-filled gifts to children. And so here's the scripture today, Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Ask and it will be given to you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be open for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be open. Is there anyone among you who, if a child asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if the child asks for a fish, will give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your God in heaven give good gifts to those who ask? So that's what came to mind for me today. This is a scripture, when we read it through the Wesleyan Methodist tradition, is about grace. It's about God giving abundantly to all people, God's grace. And that it is in receiving that grace by the knocking, the seeking, the finding, that we fully realize God's great gift of grace in our lives, God's unconditional love for each one of us in our lives. I find it very interesting that Jesus uses a child as an example, as the one who is beneficiary of these good gifts, and that parents and guardians want to give good gifts to their children, and no matter what. Even after a week of spring break with my 5th and 7th grader, who are now back in Dallas ISD, I still want to give them good gifts every day. This is something that we want to do. And so when we're talking about public education and in our public education ministry at First United Methodist Church Dallas, we want to give good gifts by giving to teachers because they're in the front lines with our students, particularly in this time of pandemic. We want to give good gifts to students as we aid them in reading and math. We want to give good incentives for older students to stay involved and active in their education. We want to give good gifts to their parents to support their children's education. And as a Wesleyan Methodist, and looking through that lens, we know that this is a part of our DNA as United Methodists, that John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, organized in classes and bands. He believed in an intentional education for every person. And that started with a basic education for every child, to know the basics of what they needed to know so that they could be not only successful in life, but also be fully spiritually formed in God's grace. That education was a part of that. And so when we're talking about advocacy with public education and healthcare and those things that give good gifts to all of God's children, we want to model that in the same way of grace. And using John Wesley's general rules is a part of our advocacy method. And the first of those general rules is to do no harm. And so when we're looking at policies, we want to make sure that we're advocating to do no harm. So if there are policies that are doing harm, we want to stop those policies and encourage new policies. And for me, this means looking through the lens of racial equity always, that we have much of what we see in our state and our nation is built upon racialized education and racism. And so we want to make sure that we are doing no harm. And then going the second step for the second general rule, to do good. And this means supporting as many children as abundantly as we can. And so that when it comes to funding, we want to shoot for abundance for children and for teachers and for the whole support network of public education by doing good for the most people that we can most abundantly. And then the third general rule is to stay in love with God. And really thinking through this education as a means of grace. I think John Wesley would say that education is a means of grace. And so when we are thinking about being the receivers of grace, we definitely want to receive God's grace, and then we want to turn around and give God's grace. And that in the Wesleyan tradition, we would also model a society and a community of the kingdom of God here on earth as it is in heaven. So I am very hopeful, excited for our time together. And I hope that as we are talking about public education, that we'll be asking those key questions about how are we giving good gifts, the most abundant gifts to all of God's children? How are we advocating to do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Holly. And I just have to say to the audience, I have loved this new segment, opening up the work week with a weekly word. And so really appreciate today's. I can't think of a better way to start the work week than with a conversation about the 3 simple rules. So thank you, Holly, for the time and for that word today. All right. Next, I'd like to welcome to the conversation Ellen Williams. Ellen is a mom of a public school student and a 5th-generation Texan. She's worked in 3 branches of Texas government, as well as the 4th estate. She reported for 3 legislative sessions for Texas Monthly's Best and Worst Legislators while attending UT, Hook'em Horns. She worked as a general counsel for Senator Bill Ratliff on the historic 1995 overhaul of the Texas Education Code that restored local control to school districts and has been a registered lobbyist for 25 years. Ellen advocates for Texas school districts and for public education. And I'll note that she is in the Capitol today. And I know that Ellen and I can be friends because she still believes that there's a pandemic going on and is kind and respectful and wearing a mask in the Capitol. So thanks for being with us, Ellen.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity. And I hope that y'all can hear me all right. I am wearing a mask. I'm inside the Capitol, and an office was kind enough to let me borrow their office today. So in the kitchen, I am broadcasting from here. So I'm very pleased to be on, and I very much appreciate the word from Matthew chapter 7 this morning, and for your weekly word. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And really, thanks for taking the time. I know it's a busy time for folks like you. So carving out time while you're in the Capitol is something that we certainly appreciate. And I know our listeners will say the same. So let's start out. So Texas Impact and our members are pro-public schools. So what are the main issues that members should be watching during this legislative session?
Texas education has been greatly impacted by the pandemic. We went about a year ago. And I have a 7th grader. We were on spring break, and then all of a sudden we were on spring break forever. So we did remote learning all of the last year, And then this year, our kids have been remote learning, back to face, kind of back and forth in some cases. And the needs of the children, the needs of the staff, and I'm so pleased that teachers are now able to be vaccinated for COVID. And then those of us that are in the, being 50 is finally good for something. But the main issue this session, I believe, is funding to ensure that public education can meet the many challenges, the very serious challenges that our students and staff are facing. And coupled with that is the local discretion to be able to use those funds appropriately so that the people who are closest to the children are the ones who are making those decisions. We have got COVID learning loss. I've seen it personally. Mental health needs. There are so many children, middle school kids, high school kids who are struggling in this pandemic, and the mental health needs of these children are paramount. We've also got infrastructure needs as well at the schools to make sure that as we bring kids back, it's safe to do so. There are HVAC issues, making sure that the air quality, this is an airflow thing. I had COVID before. It's all related to airflow, and having that the challenges as our schools move back to face-to-face learning while still continuing remote learning for those students who need it and whose families need it to keep them safe. So really funding and local discretion would be the keys to success in this legislative session. We had some federal funds. The first round of federal funds were supplanted by the state, and the next rounds are still kind of under negotiation. They're supposed to be given to the school districts for their use, the large part of them. And again, making sure that these funds actually reach the decision makers who are closest to the students is the key here, so that it's not kind of swept up by the state for other things. So that's really probably one of our biggest issues this session.
And we'll certainly be keeping an eye on the funding piece. How will you be watching that, and how can people kind of stay attuned to the funding piece of it?
The House bill, and we've been very pleased that the House Bill 3, for example, we had that last session, and that all the state leaders and legislators across the board have been very supportive of keeping those funding levels intact, and that has been so key. The federal funding that is coming for specifically pandemic-related needs is going to be something that the Appropriations Committee, and particularly the Conference Committee, is going to be weighing in on. In fact, right now, today, the House Appropriations Subcommittee that determines public education funding is meeting right now. And there is a reminder, it was mentioned just a few minutes ago, to make sure that the money reaches school districts. That, I think, is going to be a key to making sure that we have funding going forward that reaches the local level where decisions can be made appropriately for how to best serve students.
So we mentioned, or I mentioned when I introduced you, that you were the general counsel for the Education Code overhaul in 1995. That was when the charter school, when charter schools were created here in Texas. So what's the current status of the charter school movement in Texas, and how do charters impact traditional public schools in Texas?
Sure. Senate Bill 1 in 1995, Senator Bill Ratliff, was a monumental historic overhaul of the Education Code. One of the things it did 25 years ago was created a pilot program, really, with 20 small number of charter schools as to see how it would go for innovation and for choice. But 25 years later, I have to say, I have been troubled. This next biennium, and right now the legislature is appropriating funds, it's been one of the biggest cost drivers in our state budget. They're estimating, under the Legislative Budget Board estimates, that the state of Texas will spend $8.5 billion in the next 2 years open enrollment charter schools. So this, again, has been a pretty big budget cost driver, and that's for about 7% of the kids, 6-7% of the kids. So but the issue really is that the cost to our good public schools. And there's a lack of transparency currently, and there's a lack of planning in how these are rolling out across the state. There's one decision maker, an appointed Commissioner of Education, who largely oversees the expansion of campuses and has okayed hundreds of new campuses without really any citizen input or any community, for the most part, notice, support. They can just pretty much expand and plant themselves in communities wherever the charter decides it wants to go. And since there's not a lot of transparency around this, and there's the commissioner, for example, also doesn't cost out how much more these cost the state. For example, the charter schools cost approximately $1,100 more per student for the very same student if that child walks across the street from a district to a charter. They draw that much more money. They get a special allotment if they go to that charter school. And so that costs the state budget more, hundreds of millions of dollars more than if they attended a school district. So there's the cost to the state budget, but there's also the cost to the local school district. If you have a school district campus and it's got 1,000 kids and a charter comes and plants itself, really close by and starts drawing some kids out, the school district cannot cut costs dollar for dollar. The school district cannot cut, for example, bus routes, electricity, water, janitorial services, all of these things that are fixed costs within a school. So it comes down to cutting people and programs. That means larger class sizes for the kids who choose to remain in their public school district. It means possibly having some programs reduced, cut. And that's why you see, even if more money is added to the, and we are very appreciative of House Bill 3, that sometimes districts struggle because again, they can't cut, and the net revenue loss per remaining child is spread across and it results in people and programs being shrunk. So that has really been the cost to to our public school districts. And again, there's also a lack of coordination. We've seen charters coming in right in the middle of where people are already doing a program on STEM, for example, and then they'll expand a charter and it'll be a new STEM charter, because they're innovative, but they're pretty much just duplicating existing programs. So there's a lot of things like that that just don't make any sense. And it's duplicative and it's costly.
So,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
So that's good information on charters. And I personally have been hearing a lot more about charters over the course of the last few weeks. But in the past, advocates have also had to defend against efforts to divert funding for public schools through vouchers or other mechanisms. Is that still an issue that we need to be paying attention to?
Absolutely, yes. There's that issue. And then there's also the issue of cyber charters or virtual charters, which this time around are very much in prominence because I think that folks are seeing the pandemic as a revenue opportunity. They've got a cost structure where it's just a money. I mean, if you have a lot of kids in a cyber charter, and other states have seen it as well, there have been some big problems with that. We're seeing more and more out-of-state chains coming into Texas and wanting to plant themselves here. And those out-of-state chains can have boards, Texas school boards of their Texas schools that have out-of-state folks on it, which if we learn nothing from ERCOT, maybe we should have Texans running Texas publicly funded schools. One thing that's troubling about charter schools as well is the aspect of how they treat students. This is what really, really troubles me, is they are not required to take kids who have any discipline history. So if you have a second grader, first grader, acts out, should we forever bar them from entering into being able to have that choice like any other kid? The other thing is that their special education rates are substantially below the special education population averages in the public school districts. And so that has been troubling as well. And then the amount that they spend on instruction, and this gets back to the voucher and the cyber charter issue. The amount that they spend on student instruction is substantially below what school districts spend. They also don't provide transportation largely. They kind of outsource that to mom. And public school districts serve all children. They want to equitably serve them by providing for the least of these, to provide transportation, providing food. There's some charters that don't provide food. They don't have a school nurse in the middle of a pandemic. And they don't provide they spend zero on health services. So school districts are really trying to serve the students, but we see some charter chains, especially some of the out-of-state ones, that just are not really having the best interests of our Texas students in mind. And that really concerns me with the cyber charters, because how are they going to serve them in special education? How are they going to provide for kids that are hungry, that have mental health needs? There are so many things that our schools provide that are for the whole child. And if we just write kids off onto on this pandemic, put up all these cyber charters, they have a track record in Texas. We have a few already. And they have a really terrible track record academically as well. So that's primarily one of the major things we're watching out for.
I'm curious on the cyber charter. Is that just for the pandemic, or is that like a permanent thing that folks want to try?
I think folks are using the pandemic as a reason to sell it and create it. Interesting.
I know folks were really excited coming out of the legislative session 2 years ago about the funding gains that were made. And I know you've talked about that some earlier. Is there any messaging that you would recommend us using right now around that funding, or should we feel that it's pretty safe?
We're very pleased about the House Bill 3 cost structure. There were some glitches. They're trying to fix that in some legislation. And I think if they fix those unintended consequences, where there was, for example, CTE programs did not get appropriately funded in some of the smaller districts that have diseconomies of scale. And there's some things like that I think need to be fixed from House Bill 3, but overall, we're very pleased that they're keeping the House Bill 3 funding level. We do want to see that the federal funds, and there's substantial federal funds for one-time use, but are coming down, that districts are able to appropriately use those dollars.
Right. So we always encourage our listeners and our members to make telephone calls and have meetings with their representatives, and they always like me to ask what you want them to say. So I'm just going to give you a chance. What do you wish they would be talking to their members about, and what might that messaging be from your perspective?
Just please protect our public school districts from any diversions of federal funds, and trust our local school boards and trust our local school administrators to use the funding that is being provided from federal funds to be used to address these extraordinary COVID costs. This is really the key, is having local discretion in the use of funds and enough time to go ahead and get those funds done in time so that we can have time to plan for that. Then it can be a thoughtful and good rollout. And then also protecting our school districts and their students from the growing kind of drain of funds from school districts to charter schools, and to provide for more community input on how the charter schools are created, and more transparency and planning in the process.
Right. Well, Ellen, really appreciate the time today. Anything you'd like to leave us with? Any shameless plugs you'd have for folks?
Well, I just appreciate the Matthew 7. So thank you for that. And I appreciate what Texas Impact does. And I really appreciate y'all's presence at the Capitol. I think it's so needed.
All right. Well,
thank you.
Really appreciate those words, and really appreciate the work that you do each and every day on behalf of public schools and Texas school children. So thanks for the time today, and thanks for your work. We'll look forward to talking again soon. All right. So from somebody in the Capitol to somebody who is just in the Capitol, Josh, welcome to the conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
Funny story for those who listen often. Josh usually fusses at me when I ask him how he's feeling, but today he gave me permission to ask. So you were in the building today. You were supposed to be testifying. How are you feeling? How's it going up in the beautiful pink building?
Oh man, it's well, it was a wild morning. It was a wild. I expected to be testifying against Senate Bill 7, the great big. I don't know that we have a name for it. It's a voter suppression bill. Let's just call it what it is. And I feel like we have ample evidence to back that up at this point, so I'm going to call it that. And we were surprised by an arcane Senate rule that allows senators to tag a bill when it has not been given enough notice. So the Senate only has to provide public notice for 48 hours before they hear a bill. So what has been happening is this Senate committee will post notice in the late afternoon, if not 5 p.m. on Friday, for 9 a.m. Monday hearing. And this is about the third week in a row of that. And so this time, but there's also an arcane rule that allows senators to slow a bill up called a tag if they have not been given at least 72 hours to have at least looked at the committee postings. And so they invoked this rule because it had not been posted by 9 a.m. on Friday, just to slow this bill up a little bit. And we are waiting to see when it's going to be rescheduled. Probably Thursday, but the Senate's rules are fluid. So let's stand by for that.
I'll just say on behalf of the Texas Impact staff, I think we will always appreciate an extra 24 hours and not have to spend the weekend getting ready for Monday morning hearings. I will make you say that. I'll say it. So we're waiting on that. But any other legislative update you'd like to provide for us this week?
Well, I mean, it was kind of a wild week. We talked about it a little bit, and worth talking about again when the legislature spent last week really kind of accelerating to full speed. The bill filing deadline is now in the rearview mirror. Committees are meeting for all day long agendas, and they posted for this week with even longer agendas. So those committees are full blown up and running. The rules are boy, the rules to get in the Capitol. They are not requiring a COVID test. If you want to, now it's kind of funny, the Senate, if you want to visit certain offices or if you want to go into certain Senate, if you want to go into Senate committees, you do have to have a COVID test and an armband. But the House is committee by committee. So, and the building itself is wide open to the public, no test required. So it is a little crazy. In fact, Scott, the bill I just came from, Senate Bill 7, we're going to talk more about this bill a little bit, but it has several provisions that allow poll watchers to get a lot more aggressive in the polls. Now, poll watchers are the ones that are appointed by the candidate. And the bill really disempowers the election judges. So the county will appoint election judges, one from each party, a judge and an alternate judge and two clerks. It really disempowers the election judge from being able to deal with a situation where there are disruptive poll watchers. And the irony of what I just came from, if you just, any naivety that the poll watchers won't be disruptive is frankly naive, because I just saw with my own eyes a woman who is a self-proclaimed, and she said it in testimony. I saw her last week in the House side, one of these poll watchers in Williamson County. She refused to get a COVID test, and she was just berating and yelling at the clerks for the Senate State Affairs Committee because she wasn't being allowed inside to testify on this bill without the COVID test. And she was screaming about First Amendment rights and it's my right and this and that. And she's legally incorrect, but that's not the point. Because she would not get a COVID test and they can't make me get a swab, and was just berating and saying there's going to be a lawsuit about this and threatening lawsuits and berating these clerks. Here's the irony. Those clerks worked for the chair of the committee, and Senate Bill 7 is the bill of the chairman of the committee. It's his bill, and his own clerks are getting berated by a disruptive poll watcher. And he has a bill that's going to empower these poll watchers to be disruptive in the polling locations and disempower the election judges from being able to remove that person. Meanwhile, he's got the sergeant at arms that are able to keep this disruptive poll watcher out of his committee. It's just amazing, frankly. And so I wanted to make sure we talk about that today.
Yeah, so that's an interesting observation. I have yet to be in the building, and so every time I get to hear you or others talk about what it's like inside, it's fascinating to me. So let's start walking our way through the action alert today, because it is a jam-packed action alert. For those who are watching live, I just posted the link in the chat. For those who are watching later or listening to the podcast, you can go to texasimpact.org, click on Action Center, and the action alert should be in the top left. And we mentioned last week, I'll say it again today, we're going to highlight a couple of priority bills each week, and then have kind of a laundry list of all of the other bills that our membership is interested in on the second page of that document. So today, we have police reform and we have voting rights. Since we've already broached the subject of voting rights, why don't you go ahead and talk about those two bills?
Yeah, so the focus of the week is really racial justice. And I want it framed that way because, frankly, not everything criminal justice is. Racial justice does not equal only criminal justice. I think that is actually a little bit systemically racist to reduce those things. I mean, there's a reason the civil rights movement was so focused on voting rights. And so really this week is a big week for those two things. Over on the House side, you're going to have several bills, including the one entitled George Floyd Act, and then several other police reform bills up for a hearing on Thursday in the House Homeland Security Committee. All of these bills are good bills. I hope all three of them, you should support them and get them passed out of committee. And then there's a fourth one over in the House Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee that is going to be on Wednesday. So obviously you have similar bills that get in different committees. The one over there has to do with when you have a government employee that is accused of assault, battery, false imprisonment, or other intentional tort, making them civilly liable in a personal way for what are called intentional torts in law. Basically, it's the issue of sovereign immunity and qualified immunity for government employees, making sure that there's a civil remedy for those actions as well. All four of these are really good bills. We know we're going to have folks testifying on these bills on Thursday. And we stay tuned. We're going to hear a lot more about that, but this is the week to really try to get those bills moving in committee and to have them have a really good chance for passing.
I'll just note on those, we had a weekly witness a couple of weeks ago featuring Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III from Friendship West Baptist Church and Representative Retta Bowers talking specifically about racial justice and the George Floyd Act. So if you're interested in those, you can hear a longer conversation from a previous weekly witness episode.
Yeah, we're at the point in session where there's so many bills, we've got to kind of keep moving. And thanks, Scott, for referring back to that for more details on that. Bills to oppose. The big one is Senate Bill 7. This is by far the biggest. It is, I mean, the page doesn't really matter. It's a 31-page bill. It's got a lot of objectionable provisions, almost too many to enumerate. I can spend some time going through my testimony on it. I hope we have a link to it. But yeah, there are at least 5 big objectionable provisions. And there's more than that, but really 5 that we're going to focus on, because it has a direct effect on you, our membership. The biggest one right off the bat, we've talked about before, it's having a doctor's note be required to be able to vote by mail. Frankly, we don't think it's any of the government's business what your disability is. Second, even if it was, this is going to have a disparate impact on poor and minority voters that do not have access to a doctor. In fact, many of our members don't have access to health insurance because we've been told by our membership that there are people in church that don't. And frankly, even if all those things could be remedied, you still have the issue of it being an open record. So it could be used to discriminate against you by your employer or by your insurance company. That's why this is a way to suppress the use of mail-in ballots, which are a perfectly valid way to vote for perfectly valid qualified voters. So all this talk about, we only want legal people to be voting. Well, no, that's not true. You wouldn't have this provision in here. Issue number 2 is the issue of, there's a very broad definition of what does it mean to solicit an application for a mail-in ballot. This is a very broad definition. We had the University Presbyterian Church of Austin do a campaign during the July primary to get all of its members 65 plus voting. The big reason to do that is because if you can get them out of the lines on election day, you reduce the number of people, which not only makes the polls more efficient, but cuts down on transmission of the virus in a pandemic. So the problem with the definition is that when the agent of the University Presbyterian Church calls the county and says, hi, we'd like applications to vote by mail, the bill says you can't use any public funds to coordinate with a third party to distribute these applications. So in this case, the county's use of staff time, the cost of postage, and the cost to print those applications would all constitute the use of public funds. A church can't work with a county to help get its members to apply to vote by mail. That's a suppressive issue. 2, the issue of 3, actually, the issue of lost ballots. So we had members, we know because we found out from this very project with University Presbyterian Church, we had members never receive their mail-in ballot. There's a provision in this bill that would force anybody who could not produce their mail-in ballot to vote provisionally. Current law says, if I don't have the ballot, we're going to cancel that thing out so that if it happens to arrive, it won't count. And then you go ahead and vote in person as normal. Well, what this bill would do is eliminate that process and force the voter to vote provisionally. And provisional ballots don't always count. They're subject to a lot more scrutiny, and they're subject to a ballot review board. And it's likely that your vote might not count. The 4th issue is signature verification. I know because I get birthday cards every year from my 98-year-old grandfather that signatures change over time. I have birthday cards from him where his signature, as he gets older, his signature changes. What this bill does is let a signature verification committee go back 20, 25, 30 years to look at one of his old driver's licenses from when he actually drove and compare that to his current signature. Yeah, that's not going to match because his eyesight is failing. And there's any number of medical reasons that people's signatures change over time. So it is going to lead to an increase in rejected ballots based on signatures that are otherwise valid without any opportunity to go cure your ballot to say, I am who I am. Here's my ID. That's just a suppressive tactic. And the 5th issue is the one of election judges, the one I just mentioned. There's a provision in this bill when we actively recruit and encourage you, our membership, to be election judges and serve your democracy to help implement the election. There are poll watcher provisions in here that severely disempower them. I've been an election judge too. It severely disempower us from being able to maintain efficiency and order at our polling locations. And then there's a provision in here that would expose us to litigation if we actually exert our rights to have a disruptive person removed. So it is a huge intimidation factor on election judges for being able to maintain order at the polls. And there are other provisions in this bill that allow recording devices to be carried by these poll watchers. So they're going to risk the secrecy of the ballot and then use the camera to intimidate and edit the video in misleading ways. For what? I don't know. And like I just said, the author of this bill is the chair of the committee. The chair of the committee has staff. They have clerks. And I just personally saw a poll watcher from Williamson County berate and disrupt and cause his staff a very hard time because the Senate was requiring a COVID test to go into the committee. These are all suppressive things, and this bill does not need to move forward. What else do I have on there?
Yeah, so you have Senate Bill 7, and then also in the opposed category for this week, House Bill 6.
Thanks. I was moving some papers around and now I've got it pulled up. Yeah. So House Bill 6 is the House's version. It is not exactly the same as this bill, but we're monitoring it. It has other poll watcher provisions that are equally problematic. So it's an oppose right off the bat. And so go ahead and oppose it too for the exact same reasons. Having disruptive poll watchers intimidate and I'm sure they're going to be in racially minority areas. Based on what the calls we got at the Election Protection Coalition, I say that with confidence.
Those are all later in the week with the exception of Senate Bill 7, which was supposed to be today. And so
that's right. Stay tuned. Go ahead and call on it now. Don't wait around on calling for any of these things. The hearings are probably going to be on Thursday. But House Bill 6 is a great big omnibus bill over in the House. I suspect that as these bills get moving, they start to look a lot like each other. Right now, they're different bills, but it is a vehicle for all those provisions, and we got to watch it like a hawk. And the provisions in there are pretty bad too. So it has poll watcher provisions like the ones I just talked about, and is worth calling about as well.
So big priorities for this week, racial justice, including both voting rights and police reform, but there are a lot of other bills that Texas Impact will be monitoring this week. You want to quickly go through?
Yeah, so I'm going to stick with the ones that we think have that are good for reducing racial disparity and try to keep these kind of, I'm not going in order. Maybe I should just go in order if people are following along. That would probably be best as I think about this. Let's just start at the top. Payday lending. This is an issue we've worked on for over a decade. It has kind of ground to a halt politically. Nevertheless, we are going to keep pushing. And House Bill 1916 is a small bill that prohibits the telemarketing calls by payday lenders. Payday lenders are drumming up business by doing telemarketing calls, and we should put a stop to that. So that's House Bill 1916. It's in House Business and Industry tomorrow. Another one that's up tomorrow chronologically is the homeowner's right to install solar energy, also called a Solar Bill of Rights. It's House Bill 398 by Senator Menendez. It will be in the Senate Business and Commerce Committee tomorrow. This is one of those bills that keeps homeowners associations and cities from being able to overly regulate through zoning what you can and can't do on your house. A lot of homeowners associations don't want you putting up solar on your house, and this would prevent that kind of NIMBY thing and provide the homeowner a right to have distributed generation, especially after the last ERCOT, after the blackout. We need more generation, and distributed generation is a way that homeowners can help themselves and put power back on the grid. So this is a bill it got through the Senate last time, but we want to get it moving again. Healthcare. Let's switch over to healthcare. We got a couple healthcare bills coming up. It's House Bill 133 is a bill that got through the House last time, but died in the Senate. It is in the House Human Services Committee. This is the one that would allow for 12-month eligibility for a woman after pregnancy. It is a good bill that should just be common sense, but we're going to have to fight for it a little bit, especially over in the Senate. House Bill 1045 by Rafael Anchia, Chairman Anchia. This is a bill that would allow for health care coverage for those who have been wrongfully convicted, making sure that if the state wrongfully convicts somebody and takes away years of their life for a crime they didn't actually commit, making sure that we at least provide them health care coverage as well. There are not that many people. It should not have a big fiscal note. But we are talking a couple hundred people that have had their lives, even though they're free, their lives have been disrupted. Think about losing 10 years of your career. Let's move on to House Bill 1237. This is a good racial justice bill. This is by Chairman White, James White, who's chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. This is a bill that's going to try to address some of the disproportionalities that we see based on race in the Child Protective Service system. We know from data that there's a huge disproportionality, that African Americans are much more likely to have their kids removed for no reason other than just racial bias. And this bill is going to attempt to address some of those issues in the Child Protective Service system. It's up in House Human Services on Tuesday, tomorrow as well, so make a call on it. Another racial justice bill, we talked about Senate Bill 30 last week. This is the House version of that, where you're trying to remove racist and unconstitutional deed restrictions. So these have been illegal since 1968. Nevertheless, they still sit on the deed of many properties that say you can't sell a house to an African American or something along those lines. We had, my family owned a house in College Station, Texas that said no unaccompanied, it used the word, I quote, Negroes. It said no unaccompanied Negroes on the property. This deed restriction dated back to the 19th century, if I recall. We got to find a way to get these off or remove these from deeds. And this bill would provide a process to do that. House Bill 1307. This is better medical care for pregnant prisoners so people who are in prison who have been pregnant and either were miscarried or were raped in prison. This bill would create standards of care for those situations because, frankly, the agency can't be trusted to provide that care. So we have to prescribe it in law. House Bill 2386. This is transparency for lethal injection drugs. We've been working on this issue for about 10 years. I remember when one of the first things I did at Texas Impact as a young lawyer was write a briefing for the Attorney General at that time to argue that these drugs should be, that the manufacturer of these drugs and what these drugs are and where they came from ought to be a public record. To make a long story short, they are no longer a public record. And this bill would make it a public record once again. And this is House Bill 2386 to make transparency regarding those lethal injection drugs, to create transparency and make them open records again. And then finally, House Bill 2331 is by Representative Cortez. This would support, it's just making the Texas Department of Criminal Justice plan for future disasters. So one of the big things that happened with COVID, again, with Hurricane Harvey, power outages, they need to make a plan for when disasters strike, for what they are going to do with prisoners, because the way they treat prisoners is not always the most humane, to say the least. And so making a plan for what to do with people if a natural disaster should occur. This is a good bill too. So I think that's the list for the week, Scott. And expect more packed action alerts for at least the next month or a month and a half as we kind of begin to focus in on the funnel of bills that become possible. The action alerts will be big for a while, and we'll get more and more focused as we move towards the last days. But big action alerts from here on out, probably.
It is a busy action alert, which means it is going to be a busy week, which means we really hope that Texans of Faith will use this action alert, share it with your congregation, share it with your friends, and make the telephone calls. Got a couple of questions about how we're hoping you will use this action alert, so I'd like to hit that real quick. So for each one of these bills in the action alert, there is a link to the committee members. And so I'll let you decide how you want to handle your life. You can either click on each one of those links and see if your representative or senator is a member of that committee. And if so, we hope that you'll call them. If it's easier, you can look up your representative or senator and see what committees they're on and scroll the list and look that way. Up to you. And so if your representative is a member of one of those committees, we hope that you'll make a telephone call on that bill. If they're not, I know in last week's action alert, it listed the chair and vice chair of the committee with toll-free numbers for them. This week, we've set up a toll-free number for the committee office. And Josh, I don't know if you want to say a word about, we got a question in the chat about why the committee office versus the committee chair. Do you have a?
You may be more up to speed on that decision-making process than I am. I know I wrote the action alert for the policy and then tapped out on the mechanics of how to call.
So this week, there's a committee office. We're encouraging you to call and leave a message for that committee office, and those messages will be relayed to the appropriate people. So the numbers on there for the committee office, we would encourage you in terms of prioritizing. Number one, if your representative is on a committee, call them. Number two, we hope that you will call the committee offices relevant for the priority bills. And then number three, call the committee offices for any of the other issues or bills that are particularly important to you or your congregation, or where you might have some expertise. And so
I would say more is more, but I mean, this is a priority list, but more is more. So if you don't have time, focus on your elected official first. But we hope that you would just call on all of them.
And so that is the homework for the week. If you have questions about any of that, or if you have good calls and want to relay that information to us to let us know how that went, you can always reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org, and I will funnel it to the appropriate staff members within Texas Impact. Anything else you'd like to add today, Josh?
No.
All right. Well, friends, it has certainly been a busy day today on Weekly Witness, and I am certainly thankful for Reverend Holly Bandel, for Ellen Williams, and for Josh taking the time to help walk us through this conversation today. I'd like to highlight a couple of opportunities for you to be involved. First, you're on Weekly Witness, so you know about this, but we hope that you will share this content with your friends. We'll have social media posts up later today. Share those so your friends can see it. Subscribe so more people will be able to find this information. We hope that you'll join the rapid response team. We will be sending out emails and text messages to people on that team as we have updates to this action alert, or if we learn that your representative is an important person to target telephone calls to. If you'd like to be paired up with other people in your legislative district, we hope that you'll join the legislative engagement groups. You can join the rapid response team or the legislative engagement group by going to texasimpact.org, clicking on Action Center, and you'll find a place to register for those groups. Finally, if you have other questions or need more information, you can always reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. And remember that if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members. Our work is supported by members like you. You can go to texasimpact.org/join. We said it a couple times. This is a busy week. This is a busy time during the legislative session. So make the calls. Invite your friends to join you, share the action alert, share this Weekly Witness episode. Now is the time for you and your congregations to be active and engaged. So let's get to work.